Some things I have seen in these mountains were never in the training manual. They teach you about ballistics, tactics, and the psychology of a suspect, but they do not have a chapter for a silence so deep it swallows sound, or for shadows that move when they should not. People come to the Blue Ridge and the Great Smoky Mountains for the views, for the peace, for what they call a healing escape. But they stick to the scenic overlooks and the well-worn trails. They do not talk about what hides in the deep hollows and the ancient, untouched groves. They do not talk about the parts of the forest that make even the bravest men keep their eyes locked on the path ahead and their hand resting on the grip of a weapon. My name is Josh Caldwell. I have served my country, walked the scorched deserts overseas, and trained for nearly every kind of threat this world can throw at a man. Or so I believed. I do not scare easily, but these mountains, they have a way of reminding you just how small and fragile you really are. I was assigned here on what was supposed to be a routine domestic duty. Homeland Security wanted a presence in these hills, a watchful eye along the iconic parkway. Officially, my orders were simple: patrol the Blue Ridge Parkway, respond to emergencies, and monitor the vast, remote sections of Pisgah National Forest. Most officers would call it a quiet post, a peaceful break from the chaos of the city. But I learned quickly that these woods have their own kind of chaos, and they do not stay quiet for long. My station was out of Asheville, North Carolina, and I spent long nights in the shadow of Cold Mountain, where the mist rolls down the slopes like a living, breathing entity. The air there is thick with the smell of pine and damp, ancient earth. The silence can be overwhelming, a physical weight, as if the forest itself is holding its breath, waiting. And that summer, in the middle of all that silence, something happened that no amount of training could have ever prepared me for. I thought I was the one doing the watching, but I was wrong. The mountain was watching me. It began on a night that should have been completely uneventful. I was on an overnight patrol near Looking Glass Rock, a massive dome of stone that rises out of the Pisgah forest like a titan's bald head. From my vantage point on the ridge, I could see the moonlight spilling across the endless ocean of treetops, turning the canopy a ghostly silver against the deep, velvet green. I had walked this very trail dozens of times, memorized every twist and turn. But that night, something was different. The forest grew unnaturally still. The constant, comforting chorus of crickets and katydids that usually filled the night air just stopped. It was not a gradual fade. It was like a switch had been flipped. The hooting of the owls, the rustling of small animals in the undergrowth, all of it vanished. All that was left was the crunch of my own boots against the dirt and the sound of my own breath, loud and intrusive in my ears. Anyone who spends time in the wild knows a sudden silence like that means one of two things: a major predator is near, or something else is. Something so alien that the forest's natural inhabitants would rather suffocate in their burrows than make a sound. My training kicked in. I raised my night vision binoculars, scanning the treeline, my heart beginning a low, heavy drum against my ribs. At first, I saw nothing but shifting shadows and the familiar shapes of the ancient trees. My mind tried to reassure me, to rationalize the silence. Then I saw it, a flicker of movement at the edge of my vision. Slow, deliberate, and there it was, a tall figure standing perfectly, unnaturally still at the edge of the trees, as if it had been waiting for me to look. It was not a bear. It was too slender. It was not a man. Its proportions were all wrong. Its arms seemed too long for its body, its shoulders impossibly narrow, its entire frame stretched in a way that made my stomach tighten into a cold knot. For a long moment, I tried to convince myself it was a trick of the light, an optical illusion created by the moonlight and shadows. My mind desperately tried to force it into a familiar category, but then it moved. It tilted its head, a slow, deliberate cant to the side, a gesture that broke the laws of anatomy and sent a jolt of pure, primal fear through me. No human neck could move like that. Then, between one heartbeat and the next, it was gone. It did not run or retreat. It simply vanished back into the shadows that birthed it. And I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that I was not alone on that ridge. The silence that followed the figure's disappearance was somehow worse than the silence that preceded it. The forest sounds did not rush back in. They crept back cautiously, a cricket here, the distant call of an owl there, as if they too were checking if the coast was clear. I stood frozen for a full minute, my binoculars still pressed to my eyes, scanning the empty space where it had stood. My mind raced, trying to file the image away, to categorize it as a deer, a shadow, a hallucination brought on by fatigue. But the image was burned into my memory, the impossible length of its limbs, the unnatural tilt of its head. Just as I was lowering my binoculars, my radio crackled to life, the burst of static, so loud in the stillness that I flinched. The dispatcher's voice was clear, but edged with an urgency that was unusual for a quiet mountain night. "Caldwell, report your position." I gave my coordinates, my own voice sounding distant and strained. "Copy that," she said. "We have got a situation developing in the Shining Rock Wilderness. 2 hikers, Daniel and Rebecca Miller, are overdue. Brother and sister. The local sheriff's department has requested federal support." "Federal support for overdue hikers?" I asked, already knowing the answer. "That is unusual." There was a brief pause on the other end. The sheriff's deputy found their last known campsite. The report just says, "Unusual evidence was found at the scene. They need you at the Big East Fork Ranger Station for briefing. ASAP." She chose those words carefully, and the phrase hung in the air, "unusual evidence." A cold dread washed over me, connecting the strange stillness in the woods and the figure I would just seen with this new call. These things were not a coincidence. I drove the winding mountain roads faster than regulations allowed, the headlights of my vehicle cutting through a darkness that now felt less empty and more like it was hiding something. When I arrived at the ranger station, the air was thick with tension. Sheriff Mark Rudd was already there, leaning against the hood of his cruiser, a steaming mug of coffee in his hand. He was a man who looked like he would been carved from the mountain itself, tough, practical, and not someone easily rattled. But as I approached, I saw it in his eyes, a deep, weary unease that his stern expression could not quite conceal. Whatever he had seen at that campsite had shaken him. With him stood 2 other figures. One was a Cherokee man named Caleb Harris, brought in from the reservation near Cherokee. He was a tracker, but that word felt insufficient. He did not say much, his face impassive, his eyes constantly scanning the surrounding woods as if reading a language the rest of us could not comprehend. His presence alone carried a profound weight, a sense of ancient knowledge that made the official protocols feel flimsy and inadequate. The final member of our impromptu team was Agent Sophia Delgado, a new recruit sent down from the Deep Sea Field Office. She was sharp, ambitious, and radiated an almost aggressive skepticism. She held a file and spoke in crisp, clean sentences, quick to dismiss local folklore as backwoods superstition. When I recounted the silence and the figure I saw, she offered a polite, humorless smile. "Stress and isolation can play tricks on the mind, Caldwell," she said, her tone implying that what these mountains needed was less ghost stories and more by-the-book procedure. Sheriff Rudd gave the briefing. Their tents half collapsed, gears thrown about. But there is no sign of a struggle, no blood, no animal tracks anywhere near the site. It is clean. Too clean. Delgado countered immediately. A sudden squall could explain the tent. A bear could have rummaged for food without leaving obvious prints on hard-packed earth. Caleb finally spoke, his voice low and steady, not looking at any of us, but at the dark ridgeline above. No storm came through last night, and a bear would have shredded the packs. It would not have left them. Delgado opened her mouth to argue, but seemed to think better of it. Together, we set out into the Shining Rock Wilderness as the first hint of dawn began to gray the eastern sky. I told myself it would be a standard search and rescue, that we would find the Millers cold and lost, but otherwise fine. But deep down, as the trail led us deeper into the oppressive silence of the forest, I knew better. This was not a rescue mission. We were walking into something that had been waiting for us, because the mountain had other plans. By the time we reached the miller's last known location, the sun was already a low, angry orange bleeding through the trees, casting long, distorted shadows across the ridge. With every step we took, the air grew heavier, the silence more profound. It felt like we were walking into the heart of a vacuum, a place where sound came to die. I swear the forest itself seemed to watch us as we moved, the ancient trees standing like silent sentinels. We found a campsite nestled in a small clearing near the base of Cold Mountain, and the moment I stepped into it, a cold clamp of dread tightened around my chest. Something here was fundamentally wrong. It was not one specific thing, but an accumulation of small, unsettling details that screamed of an interrupted moment, a scene frozen in panic. The tent, a high-quality nylon dome, sagged on one side. Its main pole snapped cleanly in two. It looked less like it had collapsed, and more like something had leaned on it with immense, casual weight. Their expensive backpacks were scattered in the dirt a few feet away, one of them torn open, its contents clothes, a map, a bag of trail mix spilling out onto the ground. A small cooking pot lay on its side near the treeling, dented as if it had been kicked or thrown with incredible force. But the strangest, most unnerving detail was the fire pit. A neat ring of stones had been carefully set, with tinder and kindling stacked inside in a perfect pyramid, ready to be lit. Yet it had never been used. It was as if the millers had been in the middle of a routine task, seconds away from creating the warmth and light that keeps the darkness at bay, and something had suddenly, silently stopped them. Sheriff Rudd walked the perimeter of the clearing, his face a grim mask, his hand never straying far from the holstered pistol at his side. Agent Delgado, for all her initial skepticism, was quiet now. She muttered about bears or a sudden, localized storm, but her words lacked conviction. Her eyes darted nervously toward the shadows pooling at the edge of the woods. Storms did not snap tent poles like twigs, and bears did not arrange a campsite with such subtle malice. Caleb, meanwhile, crouched low to the ground, his eyes scanning every inch of the earth. He ran his fingers across the dirt, seemingly oblivious to us, lost in his own world of signs and whispers that only he could interpret. Then I saw it. Half buried in the damp soil near the unlit fire pit, almost hidden by a patch of dead leaves, was a small, boxy object. It was a Polaroid camera, its plastic casing scratched and battered, but otherwise intact. Curiosity, or perhaps some darker instinct, got the better of me. I picked it up, wiping the dirt from the lens. It felt cold, heavy in my hand. On a hunch, I pressed the button to eject the last photo taken. There was a low whirring sound, and a blank white square slid out. The paper felt strangely cold, almost icy in my palm. I held it, watching as the chemical reaction began its slow magic. At first, it looked like nothing, just a chaotic blur of dark shapes against a slightly lighter background. Shadows against trees. I almost convinced myself it was just a bad exposure, a pocket shot, a meaningless mistake. But as the image settled and the ghostly shapes sharpened, my breath caught in my throat. There, in the background of the photo, standing partially obscured by a thicket of rhododendron, was a figure, tall, too tall. Its shoulders were narrow, its limbs stretched into impossible lengths. And its head. Its head was tilted at that same sickeningly familiar angle, as if it already knew we were looking at it, even through the frozen lens of time. It was the thing from the ridge. My hand trembled as I turned the photo toward the others. The moment I held it up, the temperature in the clearing seemed to drop 10 degrees. Caleb, who had been focused on the ground, looked up and his breath hitched in his throat, a flicker of something ancient and fearful in his eyes. Delgado's professional mask crumbled completely. Her face went pale, her mouth falling open in disbelief and horror. Even Sheriff Rudd, a man I was sure had seen everything these mountains had to offer, took an involuntary step back, his eyes wide. The photo was proof. It was validation of the nightmare I would seen. The air in the clearing changed in that instant. The feeling of being watched intensified, pressing in on us from all sides. We were not just investigators at a scene anymore. We were trespassers in a place we did not belong, and we were no longer alone. We pressed on, the damning Polaroid photo tucked into my pocket, its image seared into my mind. The faint trail leading away from the campsite was our only guide. Caleb moved ahead of us, his silence now more profound than any words could be. He moved with a grace that was almost supernatural, his eyes sharp, his steps careful and deliberate, reading the forest floor like a sacred text. The trail curved south, leading us toward a valley known as Graveyard Fields. The name comes from an old logging fire that left behind charred stumps that looked like tombstones. But the place had another, darker reputation. Locals whispered that the ground there was unsettled, that trees never seemed to grow right, their trunks twisting into gnarled, agonized shapes. I had always dismissed it as folklore until that day. The earth grew soft and peaty under our boots, muffling our footsteps until the only sound was our own ragged breathing. That is when Caleb stopped dead. He did not speak, did not turn around. He just pointed a single finger toward the ground in front of him. I stepped forward, my boots sinking slightly into the damp soil, and I saw them. Footprints. But they were not human. Not even close. They were long and narrow, each impression stretched, as if the foot that made it had too many joints, too many digits. The arch was all wrong, and the heel was lifted high, suggesting whatever made them walked perpetually on the balls of its feet, like a predator stalking its prey. But the most disturbing part was the spacing. The distance between each print was enormous, far too wide for any human stride. Whatever left these tracks covered more ground in a single, silent step than any of us could in 3. Sophia forced a laugh, a sharp, brittle sound that cracked at the edges. "It is a hoax," she stammered, her voice shaking. "Somebody's messing with us. Carved these out to scare hikers away from their moonshine still or something." She was grasping for any rational explanation, a life raft in a sea of encroaching madness. Caleb shook his head slowly, his eyes never leaving the alien prints in the dirt. His voice was low, a steady, chilling murmur. Not a hoax. Not human either. A cold dread spread through my veins, crystallizing into a terrible certainty as I stared at those prints. In that moment, I understood something I had not before. We were not tracking the hikers anymore. We were being led. Something was tracking us. By late afternoon, the oppressive canopy of trees began to thin as we neared Black Balsam Knob. The trail narrowed, forcing us into single file, the trees pressing closer, their shadows stretching longer and darker than they should have in the fading light. The air grew cold. That is when we saw it. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the sun breaking through the branches, creating a strange shape against the deepening gloom. But as I stepped closer, my breath caught in my throat and my stomach turned to ice. Hanging in the branches of a gnarled oak tree was a body. It was Rebecca Miller. Her limbs were bent and twisted at angles no human body should ever bend. Her spine arched backward in an impossible curve. She had not been hung by a rope. She had been placed there, woven into the branches like a broken doll put on display. Her clothes were untouched. Her face was serene, almost peaceful, except for her eyes. Her eyes were wide open, staring down at us with a blank, empty terror that spoke of a horror beyond comprehension. There were no signs of a struggle, no blood, nothing to explain how she had gotten there. Sophia turned away, a choked gagging sound escaping her lips. Sheriff Rudd muttered a low, vicious curse under his breath, his hand instinctively going to his weapon. Caleb just stood frozen, his jaw tight, his knuckles white where he gripped the strap of his pack. The sheer rawness of the scene was a physical assault. This was not the work of an animal or a human killer. This was a message, a display. Sophia finally snapped, her voice high and frantic. "That is it. We need to leave. Right now this is not natural. This is not safe." I shook my head, my own voice hoarse. Her brother is still out here. We can't just leave him behind." Caleb's voice was a low whisper, his eyes still fixed on the horrifying tableau in the tree. "We keep searching." The sheriff looked torn, caught between procedure and a primal instinct to flee. But the truth was plain on the horizon. The last sliver of daylight was being swallowed by the ridge. We would not make it back to the ranger station before dark. We had no choice. We had to stay. We set up a cold camp in a small, flat patch of ground not far from the grove where Rebecca Miller's body still hung in the deepening shadows. The decision was made without a vote. It was a grim necessity. Sheriff Rudd ordered no fire. He claimed it was for tactical safety, to avoid giving away our position, but I knew the truth. We all did. He was afraid of what the light might draw out of the darkness. The forest pressed in around us, thicker and more menacing than ever before. Every sound felt amplified, the rustle of a leaf, the snap of a twig, while the overwhelming silence felt heavier, more suffocating. I sat with my back against the rough bark of a pine, my rifle gripped so tight my knuckles were white, my eyes scanning the impenetrable wall of black that surrounded our small island of terror. The forest never truly sleeps, but that night it felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for the curtain to rise on the final act. Then, the shadows began to move. At first, it was just the gentle sway of branches in a non-existent breeze. Then came the crunch of leaves, soft but deliberate, circling our position. Not the random scuttling of a small animal, but a measured rhythmic sound. The sound of something pacing. My pulse hammered in my ears, a frantic drumbeat against the silence. And then came the whispers. They drifted through the dark from all directions at once, low and layered, like dozens of voices speaking in a language older than the trees themselves. The words were guttural, incomprehensible, but their meaning was terrifyingly clear. "You do not belong here." Sophia, who had been sitting hunched over with her arms wrapped around her knees, stiffened beside me. "Do you hear that?" Her voice was a ragged crack in the stillness. Before any of us could answer, she screamed. It was a raw, primal sound of pure agony. Her body was yanked backward with impossible force, as if hooked by an invisible rope. She was swallowed by the darkness. One moment she was there, a terrified woman 3 feet away from me, and the next her hands were clawing uselessly at the dirt as something dragged her into the trees. I did not think, I just reacted. I lunged after her, my flashlight beam cutting frantic, bouncing path through the undergrowth. Caleb was right at my side, moving with a speed that defied the treacherous terrain. My light caught a flash of movement, pale and swift. And for the first time, I saw it clearly. Its skin was a sickly, translucent gray, stretched so thin over its skeletal frame that I could almost see the bones beneath. Its limbs were impossibly long, its fingers ending in black, sharpened points that scraped against the earth as it moved. And its eyes. They were not eyes at all. They were black voids, empty holes that seemed to drink the light and reflect nothing but a cold, ancient hunger. I raised my weapon, the training taking over, and fired a 3-round burst. The sound of the shots ripped through the woods, a violent, futile intrusion. The thing flinched, not from pain, but seemingly from the noise itself. It did not fall. It turned its head toward me, that same slow, deliberate neck-snapping tilt, as if it wanted me to see that my technology, my power, was utterly useless against it. Caleb fired too, his shotgun roaring in the dark, but the buckshot had no more effect than my rifle rounds. It was like shooting at a phantom. Sophia was still screaming, her cries growing fainter as it dragged her deeper into the forest, kicking and clawing against the ground. We ran after them, crashing through thorns and branches that tore at our skin and clothes. But a horrifying realization began to claw at me with every desperate step. The creature was not just fleeing with its prize. It was too slow, too deliberate. It was hurting us. It was leading us somewhere. And I knew, with a certainty that turned my blood to ice, that we were not going to like where that was. We ran until our lungs burned and our muscles screamed for release. The forest whipped past us in streaks of black and gray, a disorienting, nightmarish blur. Branches tore at our arms like claws, and unseen roots snatched at our boots. But still we ran, chasing the ghost of Sophia's fading cries. The truth of my earlier realization was a cold, sharp stone in my gut. It was not just chasing us, it was hurting us, leading us somewhere with a terrifying, intelligent purpose. And then, through a gap in the trees, I saw it. Leaning against the side of the ridge, weathered and half swallowed by the woods, was a structure. It was an old U.S. Forest Service ranger station, long abandoned, its windows like hollow eyes in a skull. It was our only chance. Caleb shoved the heavy wooden door open, the wood groaning in protest, as if it had not been touched in a generation. We stumbled inside, dragging a whimpering, traumatized Sophia with us, and slammed the door shut just as something heavy slammed against it from the outside. Sheriff Rudd, his hands shaking, slid the rusted iron bolt into place. For a single blessed moment, all we could hear was the sound of our own breathing, ragged and desperate in the suffocating darkness of the cabin. Then it came. A slow, deliberate scratching. The sound of long, hard claws dragging across the wood just inches from where we stood. Each scrape was an eternity, making the thick timbers of the cabin shudder. I pressed my back against the door, my heart thundering against my ribs, feeling the vibrations through my spine. The air inside felt heavy, thick with the smell of damp earth and rot, as if the cabin itself was holding its breath right along with us. Then the whispers returned. They were not faint this time, not drifting on the wind. They were louder, clearer, curling through the cracks in the walls like smoke. They were inside with us. Voices speaking in that ancient layered language, a tongue I did not know, but one that pressed against my chest, filling me with a primal cellular dread. And then something changed. The nature of the whispers shifted. They were not just the creature anymore. A new sound rose to meet them, a sound from the forest itself. It was stronger, steadier, older. Cherokee words, deep and rhythmic, rolled through the night, a powerful, resonant chant that seemed to emanate from the very earth beneath us. The scratching on the door stopped abruptly. The thing outside moaned, a high, hollow sound of pain and fear that shook the floorboards. Then silence. It was gone. It had been forced back, driven into the deep woods by something older and more powerful than itself. Something that was not with us, but was not against us either. It was the mountain, reasserting its dominion. We stood frozen for what felt like hours, our ears straining in the absolute silence, waiting for it to return. When the chanting finally faded back into the earth, I looked down at the door. The claw marks were still there, carved deep into the wood, stark and undeniable in the first gray light of dawn. Morning came empty and unforgiving. The forest outside looked peaceful, unchanged, as if the horrors of the night had been nothing but a shared nightmare. But we knew better. We searched for days after that, combing every ridge, every hollow, every trail. We never found Daniel Miller. No footprints, no scraps of clothing, not a single trace. He had been taken, erased from the world like so many others before him. Sophia never recovered. Within weeks, she submitted her resignation from Homeland Security and left North Carolina for good. The last I heard, she went west, somewhere flat and open, somewhere far from the shadows of mountains and ancient forests. Sheriff Rudd stayed on in Asheville for another year, but the man I saw at the station that first night was gone. He retired earlier than anyone expected, and they say he never set foot near the Shining Rock Wilderness again. And Caleb, he did not speak a single word of what happened. Not to me, not to the sheriff, not to anyone. He returned to his people, deeper into the Cherokee Nation, where the land is thicker, older, and the old ways still hold power. He stayed there. And me, I am still here. I walk these mountains, I patrol these ridges, but I do it now with a truth I wish I did not know burning in my gut. Some parts of the Blue Ridge do not belong to us. They never did. This land has guardians, ancient and powerful, and not all of them are kind. So hear me when I say this. If you hike these trails thinking your GPS and your high-tech gear will save you, thinking your courage makes you safe, you are wrong. Remember this, the mountains were here long before us, and they will be here long after we are gone. And some things out here are always watching.